This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Imani Perry, who teaches in the departments of African and African American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Harvard University. She has published extensively in popular and scholarly venues and is the author of 8 books: Prophets of the Hood, Politics and Poetics in Hip Hop from 2004, More Beautiful and More Terrible, The Embrace and Transcendence of Racial Inequality in the United States from 2011, Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, May We Forever Stand, A History of the Black National Anthem, and Vexy Thing on Gender and Liberation, all from 2018, Breathe, A Letter to My Sons from 2019, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon Line to Understand the Soul of a Nation from 2022, and Black and Blues, How a Color Tells the Story of My People from 2025. Perry was also named MacArthur Fellow in 2023. In this conversation, we discuss the contours of Black study, the expansiveness of the Black studies imagination, and the place of gender and cultural studies in the field. Good afternoon, Imani. How are you today?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
I'm great. First real spring-looking day here in the DMV. So, as I was saying before I hit record, a very sparsely attended class today, but for once, for good reasons, I guess. But I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I'm really thankful in advance for your thoughtfulness and contribution to this series. I think you have a really important perspective to lend the series. The kind of work you do does so much of the promise of Black studies in terms of moving across all kinds of ways of writing and thinking and geographies and so forth. So really having your voice on this is really important. I appreciate your time and thoughtfulness, and welcome to the Black Studies Podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So we'll have a chance to talk about your research and how you think about your work in relation to the field of Black studies, its challenges to the field, also where it fits. But I wanted to start with really a more personal question and ask, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And what sustained you in relation to this kind of work?
So this is such an interesting question for me because on the one hand, I guess I have always been, I don't know, maybe not interested in Black studies, but deeply invested in Black art and culture, so that, I was a voracious reader as a child. I came of age in that beautiful Renaissance moment for Black women's literature. And so, I feel like I came into being with the words of Morrison and Alice Walker and June Jordan. And so there was, sort of like what we consider Black studies was integral to my becoming. And I'm also a movement baby, so that was part of it too. But academically, I felt I sort of saw myself as someone who was in American studies and someone who studied race, even though I had Hazel Carvey as a mentor in college and Robert Steptoe. And it wasn't really until graduate school that I felt myself shifting into Black studies. And I think that it was a combination of forces. I mean, partially it was, the 90s was that sort of heyday period, and there was so much that was exciting that was identified with Black studies proper. And then I guess I had, in college I was at Yale, and that was the moment when in American studies we were studying the Birmingham School, and that was like, it's like, and so the cultural studies piece that I had done in college, I was sort of moving from that to thinking more deeply about standing in a tradition of Black studies overtly. And so I came to it formally maybe in my second year of graduate school. But it was also always a part of me. And I guess, it's some of it is coming of age as a child of the movement after the movement is over. And you're trying to, I came of age with these values and commitments to, radical politics and Black liberation, and thinking about it internationally. And then there's no movement. And the place you go is the
Mhm.
world of ideas when there's not a movement in which to find yourself and to make sense of the world.
I'm interested to, I mean, it's been really interesting in this series. People who have a similar kind of story about being movement babies, and then what books and ideas and higher education mean for that complex relationship, as you put it. I'm interested to hear a little bit about how, before you were in college, like how that K through 12 education, like, did you feel like college was where you kind of got a moment to connect the movement stuff to education, or was it always also part of your formal education?
I mean, yes, in a sense that felt like sort of more serious. I mean, I was a kid in high school who's always sort of trying to issue some kind of protest and, you know, change curriculum, and like I was that person, but to in terms of trying to connect, well, no, maybe because we also. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting myself, but like this was in the midst of also the anti-apartheid movement, which was
Yeah.
important in high school. That I belonged to a student organization that organized around the anti-apartheid movement, and so I felt like there was always some degree of connection. But I guess I got to college, and it was the stakes are greater,
Mhm.
and the ideas are bigger, and there's a real sort of explicit connection between sort of understanding that relationship between the theory and the ideas and the organizing, in an academic setting. Yeah, because sort of like being in having organizers in the living room as a kid, and they're all talking about ideas and books and the like, but it's very different for that to be really in a formal academic setting. So that was um, much more formalized once I went to college, and I also felt more powerful. I mean, it was sort of like, you get to college, and then you actually, when you decide to organize something, it's a much bigger deal than when you're in high school.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
I just think about a lot of those moments where for some folks it's like some sort of engagement with, whether it's through literature or other sort of reading, engagement with Black life as a sort of escape from this sort of fucked up
yeah,
education they're getting,
yeah,
or the home is that place of retreat. But that the sort of situation you're talking about coming from is sort of like already awash in these kinds of ideas and
yeah.
thoughts and concepts that I like that as it gets more serious when you're in college. I mean, do not in high school. I
And
mean.
also, it's interesting because I got plenty of I had plenty of fucked up academic experiences, but it was always a mixed bag all the way through.
Mhm.
Encounters with racist educators and just terrible experiences, but there was also always the other side of the pendulum swing, and so even that made the educational space feel political in a meaningful way. The fact that I had, this wide array, and I knew that the faculty, even in high school, weren't on the same page,
Mhm, mhm.
with each other often. Yeah.
So, I mean, talking about this sort of politics and education, sort of picking up with that, I'm interested in hearing you talk a bit about the portrait of Black studies that you work with. So, what's that idea that orients you? And I ask this in the context of the origins of the field, which really had that tension between study and politics, right? That the origins of the field is students demanding that there be a place on campus where you can study the Black intellectual tradition, sociology, art, and so forth. And, Black studies departments have been that, right? That
Right.
the disciplines had not done this work. But also, of course, that's a moment of the radicalization of Black liberation struggle in which those distinctions between a classroom and a community, between books, ideas, and political mobilization and political prescription had gotten blurred, if not outright obliterated, like deep
Yeah.
contestation. And so I think we inherit that today in this sort of tension at the heart of Black studies, which is a commitment to a certain kind of politics, but also a commitment to the study of the intellectual tradition.
Mhm.
And I'm interested in that portrait of Black studies you work with in that context, emerging, as you said, out of that, the sort of politics and study of it all.
Yeah, I think it's, such an interesting moment. I love that you asked that question because, for so long the account, and it's not a unique account, but that I've thought about, you know, clearly, right? So Black studies emerges, at least in terms of the formalization of its emergence, because I also think there's an account we can offer from the early 20th century too. But if we think
Mhm.
about the sort of the institutionalization in higher education happens, right, as you said, in the midst of Black liberation movements domestically, internationally. And then there is a push through in a subset of Black studies programs, um, through its formalization to depoliticize it, right? So there's a host of programs that devote a great deal of attention to focusing on the fact that they are formal modes of academic inquiry as opposed to a political site, right?
Mhm.
And I have always had some critique of that move because the political sensibilities that are part of Black studies actually are about they're deeply intellectual because they're about what point does the production of knowledge serve, right? What's behind a commitment to the production of knowledge? And that is those are political questions, right? Even if people
Mhm.
pretend as though they're not. What's interesting in this moment is that the idea that Black people have contributed anything meaningful to any sort of any not I don't even know the word civilization isn't appropriate, but like to intellectual life, cultural life is
Mhm.
actually um is no longer accepted at face value, right? So that the very existence of any Black studies program now, even if it is what we might consider depoliticized, has heightened political significance in this moment because the
Mhm.
very idea of studying Blackness, Black people as such is under threat. And so I say that because I wonder then if we might need to sort of reevaluate the range of the ways we think of Black studies as a political project. Because and maybe and I say maybe I am guilty of this too of being too flip in my critiques of some of what I thought of as the depoliticization of Black studies. Maybe its mere existence is political. And so that's one thing. And then the other
Mhm.
part is I think, this range is so great. It's not, there is, this kind of nationalist tradition, this leftist tradition, internationalist tradition, and that the departments have different iterations and configurations of all of these traditions simultaneously. And then within the nationalist tradition, there's also the kind of cultural nationalism versus the sort of more political nationalism. So it's still so and now I've talked so much I forget the origin of the question, but yeah, but I think that I think that there are politics in all of it, even
Mhm.
when people try to depoliticize it. Maybe that's the short way of saying it.
Yes, it's interesting. Thank you for that. I mean, um, what you were saying before about maybe being too flip at times about the depoliticization of Black studies work. I mean, I just think specifically the timeline of this podcast when Ashley and I first started it,
Mm,
and we came up with these questions and had this question. And that was just early 2024. And it's in early 2026. It really sounds like a totally different question just in 2 years'
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Where just the mere existence, as you said, of Black studies is itself a really provocative political statement in some places. And it's been interesting to me to reflect on what it means to have asked this question at two different times. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah.
It's not really about me or us in this podcast, but it's like I think it reveals a lot of what you've been talking about in terms of the way this has become increasingly political as we're under threat. But also, the question is also a reminder that it was deeply political when we thought it was a little bit too depoliticized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was.
I don't know. We are completely awash in terribleness these days.
We are.
It's hard to see outside of that.
That's true. All the more reason
Well,
to do what we do, though. Yes.
I could not agree more. So let me ask about your work then. Your work is really an interesting mix, as I said at the beginning. In some ways, such a Black studies trajectory in your own writing, in terms of having that interest in cultural studies and literary studies, but also memoir and the personal essay. And I'm interested how you think that your work in these series of frames in which you write, how you think your work fits in the history of the field of Black studies, and what horizons do you think it opens up, or what boundaries do you think it pushes?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. That's another really good one. I mean, so I started my career as a legal historian, and I wanted to study law initially because I was trying to figure out how power worked, and in the society. So I had studied so much about culture, but I didn't quite feel like I had a grasp on the sort of the mechanisms of power. Um, and and so I spent a lot of time working on sort of understanding how private law in the late 19th and early 20th century was integral to the establishment of a Jim Crow order. Right? And so for me, that was part of the like firmament, right? So, and I mentioned that at the beginning because part of what I've been trying to do is sort of twofold. One is I'm always trying to understand, and sometimes I think the word is retrenchment, and sometimes I think the word is just resilience of domination, and all the forms of injustice that are made structural. And so sort of the 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, or 3 steps forward, 2 steps back of the thing, right? That's one of the questions I'm always trying to figure out. And then the other side, which I think is sort of where the core of who I am in terms of Black studies has emerged, is how it is that there is this persistence of imagination and beauty in the face of that, and what use we make of that imagination and beauty in the service of liberation, or getting us closer to something that looks like a beloved community. I mean, I think all my work fits into those boxes.
Mhm.
um, I, you know, if I were to trace myself as part of a genealogy of, or that I'm reaching for, there's always Du Bois, there's always Morrison, there's always June Jordan, there's Sterling Brown, there are these figures, of course, people like Sonia Sanchez and Angela Davis, which is partially also my deep identity as being someone born in Birmingham, Alabama, and that particular Black radical tradition that comes out of that place. Um, and so the thing that I see amongst the people who I feel like I'm trying to sort of walk in the steps of is a kind of expansiveness, an intellectual expansiveness, a refusal, so that a commitment to rigor, but a refusal to be bound by form.
Mhm.
What I am trying to reach for, and I actually think that younger people, really people who are sort of the millennial generation, as opposed to uh, those of us who are like, I don't know, I would say Generation X. We're sort of. almost elders, but because the old people won't get out of the way, we never really get to step into we don't get to be that. So, whatever.
It's
Basically,
really true. It's
right,
so true. I think we're near the same age. I know
right,
what
yeah.
you're talking
They
about.
won't let us get stuff with it. But I mean, but I think, I would say the older ones of my students I've trained really showed me that you don't actually have to choose between doing work that is imaginative and scholarly. And and so many of them just absolutely refusing to make that choice. I feel like that freed me up to say, okay, I want to maintain the rigor of scholarly research. But I also want to write and communicate in ways that speak on multiple registers that connect with the heart as well as the head. And I think that in many ways, that's sort of the best of the tradition anyway. But that professionalization piece, I think, has disciplined so much of that out of so many of us, right? And trying to reach back for it, both because I love beautiful writing, and so I want to try to write beautifully, and I want people besides those in the ivory tower to read my work. But also because I do think these questions are not just intellectual questions; they're deeply emotional questions, and I want to be clear about the emotional stakes as well as the intellectual work stakes in the work that I do.
I love that. Thank you. I really like the way you wrap that up back into the emotional element of the work, but also the way academic training does discipline us in terms of the kinds of voice we allow ourselves, which, I mean, I think as you point out, especially, indirectly in terms of the people you referenced, the part of what's so amazing about reading Jordan or Du Bois or Morrison is their infusion of this analytical writing with the personal,
Yeah.
right? Where we never lack a sense of the passions of these people. Even somebody as, I mean, I think Du Bois in some ways is a very detached writer, but
Yeah.
he's also deeply attached, right? Um,
Yes. And it
and
does
if
so go ahead.
no, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I think I love Du Bois is such a good example, and Morrison too, because for this particular point, they can be very difficult, right? So my point is not about
Oh yeah.
accessibility, like in the conventional
Mhm.
say, like, oh, everybody should be able to read. No, I believe that it's okay to have people stretch when they read, right? I love to stretch myself when I read, but you can still be inviting people in, even if it's going to require some work to get into it, right? And I think that for me is the difference.
Yeah, and generally, I'm kinda cranky about generations. This is where I guess maybe I'm trying to force into elder status and be like the kids today with their but I agree with you. I love the impatience of millennials and after in terms of the desire to do multiple forms of writing at once. I feel challenged by that. Working on my own new project and trying to make first person a part of it, and boy, it's not easy stuff.
Yeah.
Talk about being I mean, my PhD's in philosophy, so
Well, philosophy
it's
is a
like
whole different that's like a different level. Like, I mean,
yeah,
it
it's
really is.
a
Yeah.
long route to go down here to become a different writer. Well, speaking of training, uh, academic training, you mentioned you have law degree. Your PhD is in American
Mhm.
Studies, and your appointment now, and it's been, of course, your appointments over the years, been in Women and Gender Studies and African American Studies. And one of the things that strikes me is how you've so consistently worked outside of disciplines,
Mhm.
right? American Studies,
Yeah.
your doctoral training is not disciplinary. And I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how that work outside of disciplines has shaped how you conceive a research project, and also, if you want, how it's shaped how you conceive a classroom and how you practice as a teacher.
Yeah. Oh, those such good questions. Yeah, in terms of how I conceive a research project, I start with a question. And then so much time is spent reading because I'm trying to figure out not just what I need to read across the disciplines to answer the question, but how do I learn how to read in various fields? So
Mhm.
learning how, and I, I don't, I think for me, this is actually the core of the disciplinary training piece that I'm always trying to sort of keep track of is less methodology, right? I have my own wacky methods, but it does matter if you know how to read a piece in a given field, like to
Mhm.
understand the stakes, to understand where someone sits in the conversation. And so what it means is that it's a lot of my work is about learning how to read, habits of reading, learning how to read and reread because fields change, right? And so sometimes that means I need to go to conferences to figure out the shift in the conversation just in order
Mhm.
to read in a given field. So I start with a question and then I try to read around the question from multiple fields. And then I sort of that becomes a process of refinement, knowing even better what I need to corral to answer the question, and then how to put the sort of the raw data of whatever I'm doing in conversation with multiple fields, and which is both a question for me of method, but also of language, right? How do you figure out how to speak to people and have a language that works where you're not constantly translating as you write, but that
Mhm.
people can read from various areas? And that is very similar to what I'm doing in the classroom because I often have students, particularly my grad students, come from wildly different departments,
Uh-huh.
and they have to learn how to speak to each other and they have to so I make them slow down, because grad students do this thing and they'll start talking as so and so says. They're like, okay, we just assume that 80% of the classroom hasn't read that person, so
Mhm.
then you have to actually tell what is this person saying and why are they saying it, and then can you make the point and be part of this conversation even if people don't know that, right? So the classroom becomes an occasion for students to learn outside of their departments and fields. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I think it's a good exercise regardless, but but it can be challenging. And I think the way that I sort of mediate against the frustration is that I try to sort of actually have them read across fields too, so that then they experience both being very comfortable and also being somewhat unmoored. I tell the story all the time of being in this class that Cornell West taught on social theory, where everybody else was trained in philosophy. Most of them were Morehouse grads who were now at Harvard. Some of them were from other institutions. All these people with all this, and I had come this is when I my first year grad school. I had done cultural studies. I didn't know any philosophy, right? I mean, I did, but it was like this sort of, I didn't know the people I read had read before.
Mhm.
and so,
Mhm. Yeah.
and so I was deeply intimidated in this class because I did not have all of these reference points. And I was used to sort of dominating class discussions. I was that kid and I was silent most of the semester. And it was the most exhilarating academic experience I've ever had because I
Hmm.
didn't know what was happening. And I was trying to play catch up and I was trying to take notes and that actually was something that was extraordinary for me. Um, yeah. So I guess I'm trying to replicate that on a certain level by
Mhm.
by
Mhm.
working in multiple fields too, reading in multiple fields.
I appreciate you saying that. First of all, I think, my graduate courses have students from multiple places, and,
Mhm.
there's definitely that, like, I feel depressed or behind or inadequate, because I can't follow the references. But now I can say, well, if you listen to this podcast episode, Imani Perry said it was exhilarating, so go be exhilarated.
Right. But it's like there's something wonderful about not knowing what
Yeah.
you're doing.
And I think, your account of how you conceive a research project as guided by questions, and then so what helps you answer that, but then the immense amount of work that requires. I think this is important. This has come up in a number of these episodes, and I always underscore it because, having spent the first 5 or 6 years of my career in philosophy departments before moving to Black Studies, Definitely moving to Black studies from the philosopher's perspective was always this sort of, well, you've moved somewhere that's easier,
Right,
right? That there was something easier. And I've always said, it's so much more difficult precisely because of how you put that. You put it so well it's not just, well, I'm going to read some sociology, but I have to understand what it means to read sociologically.
Yes.
And what it means to read this text as a bit of sociology in, the year 2026 that was written in 1990. That's not... And that is exhilarating, but it's also an immense amount of work.
It is. It's so much work. And it lends itself, I think, to really important insight. There's a humility that comes from, I think, an awareness of how many different ways people are approaching the same question, and trying to doing some work of synthesis. But I also just deeply think one of the great things about Black studies is because the tools of the traditional disciplines have always been limited by the logics of white supremacy and empire, that they never are fine enough on their own. And so they always require some modification, even for someone who is doing work in a conventional discipline, just doing Black studies. It just, there always has to be some modification. So in some sense, moving across disciplines allows you to sort of borrow techniques that help you cobble together a way of being rigorous without all of the enormous limitations that the traditional disciplines have, just by virtue of the traditions of commitment that they entail.
Yeah. This, I think, then is maybe a nice segue to one of my last two questions for you, is then thinking about the field of Black studies and, what it's, we can think about it institutionally, but also, as you said, there's a longer story to be told, the early 20th century, if not late 19th century. But thinking about the field of Black studies, what do you think it has done well, but also what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Ooh. What do I think it has done well? I mean, I think that when it is done well, to understand the social, political, and material dimensions of expressive culture or creative work. I can't think of a field that has wedded those together in as fine a fashion, right? To understand, here are a set of deep, can look at the blues and understand it in terms of sociologically, economically, philosophically, theologically, like that. To be able to have a tradition that can look at an art form and pull out all of those meanings without torturing it is remarkable. Yeah. And so, just holding on to, my friends always sort of laugh because I'm always want to think about material conditions. Like I never want to let that go. And I do think that the best of Black studies holds on. I worry when we don't hold on to material conditions. I worry when Blackness is conceived of without attention to the other ways in which human beings are organized, whether that's sexuality or class or, belonging to nation states or being, those types of questions. And so, in some sense, like it's what it does best is also sometimes its downfall, because there is work that so wants to conceive of Blackness divorced from all of those other conditions, and also to exceptionalize it to such an extent that it cannot be understood in light of other sort of racialized experience or colonized experiences. And I think that that's a danger, and a danger that has grown in recent years. Yeah. So.
It's interesting just to think about figures in the tradition who really press us to think exactly in the way that you're saying, needs to be thought. I mean, Angela Davis's name has come up a couple times. I happen to be teaching a seminar on her this semester, and my students who are Black Studies students are like, oh, all of a sudden all these other things matter to Black Studies questions. And it's been interesting, just, it's not really evidence of what you're saying, but it just strikes me as like how struck they are by these questions being compounded, right, rather than held separate.
Yeah.
And, one student said, they felt a little bit suffocated, like they didn't know which way to look to breathe or catch their breath. And, but as I pointed out, that's part of study, is really to be overwhelmed.
And I think when you ground, this is also part of my interest in material conditions, and also part of my interest in writing sort of nonfiction more broadly, because when you ground yourself in the lives of human beings, right, nobody lives their life on a single axis, right? And so if you just tell a story about a person or place, you're necessarily thinking about all of these other dimensions of experience, right? So just, so once you settle in somewhere, I think it's hard to deal with multiple abstractions. But if you don't deal with sort of the multiple sort of forces, the layers of domination, the forces upon a person's life, the way in which they're situated in relation to the land, the rest of the world, you miss out on so much. So
you would think that wouldn't be so difficult as scholars, because we all actually are also human beings, but apparently we struggle with that a little bit.
I also think
as scholars,
because some of it is, I don't know what you think about this. I think some of it is like we sort of have this experience of socialization where we all walk around with identities as like these big brains disconnected from being, almost disconnected from being embodied, right? And that is what most of us were rewarded for as we came of age. And it's the thing that is our currency. And it's easier sometimes to live with that in the realm of abstraction. And so, when you get down to those like nitty gritty aspects of life, we're also getting down to our own vulnerability and our embodiment and our fears of being disregarded and our anxiety. Like it's just it's real stuff.
Yeah.
That's not just walking around as a big disembodied brain.
I like that. You put academia on the couch there in the best way. But it's a really important thing, I think, for us to all reflect on. I mean, whether we write about figures or write about concepts, because all these things are rooted in forms of life that are multiple rather than one. So that's and the way that remains a challenge, I think, for any field. That ought to be an exciting challenge too.
I think
there's so many things that become possible when you embrace that. As you said, like the moving to more writing closer to personal life, personal essay, or whether if people are writing biographies, when you get intimate to life, that's where everything opens up. Right? Now, how do we all make that? Even those of us who write very abstractly, make that work. There ought to be ways.
I think there are, and I think the beauty, there's conceptual beauty, right? I mean, I think that's the other thing too. I don't know that it has to be like writing about life, but I do think that kind of attentiveness makes its way into thinking about how do you sort of theorize this reaching for something that is beautiful and just, and humane, even if you're not sort of like telling stories about individual people's lives.
Absolutely. And that may be already an answer to this last question I have for you, but I'll ask it. Thinking of Black Studies context, what is the one question you would want us to all be asking, or one issue you would want us to all think about?
I want us to think about archives. I am really interested in the work of unearthing material And I think there's been so much focus on the gaps and absences. And I think the gaps and absences are there, but they exist in particular places because um, of the values associated with those places. But once you start to look in, grandmother's attics and bottom drawers, then you find, once you sort of think about collecting information in some different ways, there's just so much material that has not been gathered. And I think Black Studies is still on some fundamental level an archaeological enterprise. Like there are thinkers who have not been unearthed. There's materials that have not been unearthed. There's so much that still needs to be discovered. And so I really would like people to, it's great. I mean, it's meaningful to talk about the gaps, but I would like people to also talk about where we're not looking and how to look differently.
That's an amazing place to wrap up. I love that. The archaeological project that's really going to stick with me from this conversation. I love this as a place to wrap up. And, I was really looking forward to this conversation, Imani, and it's really just been wonderful. This is such a great contribution to the series at multiple levels. And so thank you for everything. Thank you for your time and your thoughtfulness. And this has just been really fantastic.
Thank you for doing this work. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, you have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.